seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I could be hugely terrific, except that, of course, I'm going to be missing you for quite a while, I gather.
Well, I'll be back in a few weeks, but to be honest, I'll miss you too. To you, all our viewers, a warm welcome to you. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask some questions. Right away, let's maybe start in West Africa. Sierra Leone is going to the polls tomorrow. There's a lot of excitement. You have so many candidates on the ballot. Bring us up to speed.
Very interesting, of course. You are talking about 16 individuals who are vying for State House, Freetown. But probably 4 of them really have probably an opportunity or a chance or a crack at it. And there are 2 traditional, historical traditional parties. You're talking about the APC, which is the incumbent party in power. And it has a former foreign minister who a lot of people think that he might in fact be able to pull it off, because the incumbent party, of course, has a lot of advantages in terms of name recognition. You're talking about resources. You're also talking about perhaps having some kind of advantage in terms of maybe related or looking at the people that occupy the nation's electoral commission and what have you. And then, of course, you have the other party, the SLPP, the Sierra Leonean essentially progressive party, or People's Party, actually. And it is, of course, headed by a guy who at one time, for a very brief period, used to be a military head of state. Mahadubio, and some people think that he might in fact have an opportunity to get it this time around. But let's face it, you're talking about 16 candidates. You're talking about 4 who are seen as being major contenders, including a former Under Secretary General at the United Nations, who is remarkably articulate. And you're having a constitution that requires that if you have to win it all in round 1, you have, Paul, by the way, in Sierra Leone context, you have to hit 55%. The threshold is 55%.
Interesting.
Normally
50
it is 50 plus 1 vote. And there are places where it doesn't really matter. It's a very simple majority. But this one is 55%. I honestly don't know why. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for anyone to get it in the first round. So we should probably be looking forward to 2 rounds, really, a sort of a runoff, that will repeat 2 people. And one of them, of course, will make it to State House Freetown. That's how I look at it.
Shaka, you and I have had the privilege of interacting with the outgoing president, Ernest Bai Koroma. A lot of people say that he has been in power for nearly 12 years. This is the end of his second term.
10 years.
Yeah. But he hasn't done much. Sierra Leone is still recovering from war, so to speak, and they haven't had war in a very long time. When you go to any town in Sierra Leone, it's just like as if they had war like yesterday. Nothing much has been done under his presidency. So what challenges lie ahead of any of these guys who might win the presidency of Sierra Leone?
Incredible, of course, as you rightly put it. Mr. Koroma does not seem, frankly, to have made a significant dent on the situation in Sierra Leone. There was a time, of course, after the war when business was booming, especially iron ore and all that kind of stuff. But then prices fell. And when the prices fell, then obviously it didn't help later when you even have the issue of the Ebola virus. You have the Ebola virus and what have you, and everything is pretty much down. So you're going to need a person, obviously, who is very, very innovative, someone that is very creative, someone that is very, very imaginative, and somebody with definitely very new ideas. Because unemployment is very high, the young people do not have a job, they have to be put to work and what have you. So it's a question of the kind of ideas that will work in the context that obtains, right now in Sierra Leone.
But how about people who argue, for example, that it's not about credentials? For example, the outgoing president had what you could quote and call maybe impeccable credentials. He was a very well-respected man, been at the United Nations, did all sorts of things, business-wise. But even the candidates who are vying for the same seat, they all have impeccable credentials. So sometimes it's not about credentials. I think they need somebody who can actually do the work. Your thoughts on that?
I told you largely that it's going to require someone that is very innovative, very creative, someone that is very imaginative, meaning someone that can actually do it differently. Ernest Bai Koroma came from business background. He was actually successful in terms of business and what have you. And people expected him to make a difference. The person, in fact, that was president before him, a man, that had actually spent many, many, many years at the United Nations, who unfortunately died, had his own problems because obviously at one time he was overthrown. And then, of course, there was a civil war and that lasted a very long time. And, so when you brought in a new man from business and what have you, you expected that he would probably make a difference. But the fact of the matter is there were certain things on the ground that he could not control. If you can't control certain things, you probably can't get the sort of, aid or that can help to supplement or complement whatever kind of ideas you're doing. It becomes very difficult for you to deliver. So, again, like you said a little bit earlier, whoever actually becomes president of Sierra Leone at the end of the day, that particular individual has a lot of work cut out for him. The good thing, I think, about what is happening in Sierra Leone is that it looks like so far campaigning has been fine. And it seems to me that it's probably going to be an election that is devoid of violence, that probably is devoid of obvious intimidation, just like we experience in some other parts of the African continent. Because it seems to me that the people in West Africa may be onto something when it comes to the democratization process, Paul. As a matter of fact, out of, I think, there are 15 countries that form the ECOWAS, the Economic Community for West African States. Everybody except Togo agrees that a president can only serve 2 terms, each of which is 5 years, and then you go home and you pass on the baton to someone else. Just like we saw, of course, in Liberia, even though the terms in Liberia, of course, are 12, each of the maximum is 12, because each term is 6. But at least you saw a peaceful transfer of power from one individual to another. And so we expect something like that again to happen in Sierra Leone, except that, when we look at the other parts of the continent sincerely, look at Central Africa, you're talking about Equatorial Guinea, the man that has the world record. He's been in power for 37 years and still counting. And his son is the vice president. We're talking about, of course, your friend Theodore Obiang Basoga. And you look at neighboring Cameroon. You look at a man like Paul Biya. He's been in power since 1982, and he's still going nowhere. Nothing is much changing there. You have really no democracy except a facade of democracy, so to speak. Then you go to Togo. You go to some other neighboring countries like Congo, Brazzaville, and what have you. And then you go to East Africa, the Great Lakes. Then you go to North Africa, my friend. You go to the Horn of Africa. There's no democracy except in West Africa, so to speak, and probably Southern Africa.
Yeah, that's a good segue. Let's go to one of the comments, Facebook comments from Abasogi. He says, how can the electoral processes in African countries be devoid of violence, militarization, and ballot snatching, especially in light of what you just talked about, Sierra Leone?
Well, first of all, I think that people have to agree on the modus operandi. They have to agree on the rules of the game. And once you agree on the rules of the game, then you all have to respect those rules of the game. And this probably, let's face it, it comes about, first of all, because there is a sort of civic education that sensitizes, the voters and the population and what have you. And you also have to have people in power respecting the fact that they are actually employed by the masses. Because you often hear, Paul, that power belongs to the people. Even dictators, actually, who cannot cede any ground or any, frankly, any, do not even provide any access really to, the freedom, for example, of assembly, the freedom of association. They still claim that power belongs to the people, when in fact they are the ones who control it. In fact, in some cases, you can put it in the context of l'état c'est moi. I am the state, and the state is me. But they still say power belongs, yes, to the people. So if the people feel that they are empowered, they also in turn have or need to assert their power. They have to assert their clout. That's the only way it can work. Nobody is going to give you power on a silver platter. That one, you're going to have to take it. Yep. You're going to have to mobilize and organize yourselves and work within your given constitution. You'll be there.
Okay, let's move along. Let's go to another Facebook comment. Let's go to one Dalton Benedict Mutawe in Kampala, Uganda. He says, is democracy an applicable reality or an animated myth? How does democracy work at national level when it isn't applicable at the smallest unit of governance, meaning a family? Maybe you can also talk about the most recent developments in Uganda, where the president fired two security heads, the Minister of Security and the police chief. This was arguably one of the most powerful men in the country.
Well, first of all, the first question about democracy. There was once a great British Prime Minister called Sir Winston Churchill. He once actually observed that democracy is not really the panacea, so to speak. It's probably, in his view, the worst form of government, except for the rest of the other ones that we know about. In other words, democracy is not perfect, but compared with some of the ones that we have actually seen in practice, it is the best.
Like dictatorship and all that?
Precisely. You could say like communism, as it was practiced in what was called the Soviet Union, for example. You could say that the way the system was practiced, for example, in Albania, communism in Albania, so to speak, you can't compare really that type of governance with democracy, except that I would have to say that knowing what I know now, there is some other aspect of democracy that is probably better than simply saying democracy. We're talking about social democracy. Again, we're going to look at countries like the Scandinavian countries, which have really taken it some kind of a notch higher.
But
so,
Shaka, before you go, let me push back on that. There are all these countries that we talk about, they all claim to be democratic countries in Africa, especially countries where you have these strong men. They all claim to be democracies.
yeah, but I'm talking about, for example, social democracy in the Scandinavian countries. The reason I'm talking about that is because it is people-centered. It values the individual, not the structures. It makes sure, for example, that things like education, things like housing, things like medical care, those types of things like for a couple that has children, child care and what have you, those are rights, not privileges. They are rights, not privileges. And everybody has the right to vote. Everybody has the right to choose who they feel should be their representative. So in this particular case, they actually have the power. They have the power. All they do, they simply donate it to people who represent them, whether it be in the Prime Minister's office, whether it be in the parliamentary institutions or National Assembly and what have you, whether it be at local government level and what have you, it is power that is donated to them from the ordinary people. So there you can quite accurately say that actually power belongs to the people. But in situations where someone tells you that power belongs to the people, and in fact, they even call for an election, but they make sure, for example, that it is only the ruling party that chooses who is going to be part of an electoral commission, and therefore the people that are going to count the vote, that also uses, for example, state resources for campaigning and what have you, that makes sure that, yes, the people who represent the views or the opinion of the ruling party have unfettered access to the people in terms of selling their message and what have you, but that anybody else who is selling a message that is contrary to the ruling party does not have unfettered access to the people. You have seen that in Uganda. You have seen that in Rwanda. You have seen that in countries like Burundi. You have seen that in countries like Ethiopia, for example. I mean, where someone jokingly said they have 100% democracy. You have two houses, the lower house and the upper house. There are at least about 547, I think, seats. There's not a single person, a single lawmaker that represents
The opposition.
the opposition or another party. It is the ruling party, the almighty EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. That's it. So surely, yeah, those can talk about democracy, but the fact of the matter is there is no democracy. It's a facade. It's an illusion, really. It's just a joke.
Yeah, let's go to the second question. Let's talk about the developments in Uganda. The president firing one of his most trusted men, the person who got him where he is. This is a guy you could argue in any way and say that he physically handed over Museveni the presidency. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he probably handed him over the presidency in 2016. He probably, in fact, was the Electoral Commission, because my sources tell me, as a matter of fact, that it was him who was providing the results to the chairman of the Electoral Commission, and then the man would announce the results. In fact, that center was in Naguru, where it happens that you have now the police headquarters. You are talking about a general, Kale Kihura, a very highly educated individual. He has a Bachelor of Laws degree to boot from your alma mater, Makerere University, Kampala. He also has a master's degree in law from the London School of Economics. He also actually went to a very senior officers academy, I think the Air Force Academy here in southern parts of the United States for a year. So this is an incredibly educated individual. His father was also incredibly educated. In fact, he was a Pan-Africanist, Mr. Karechezi, who unfortunately died abroad while he was representing what was then called the Uganda National Congress. Kale has been really the epitome of loyalty. The man that was, you know, incredibly loyal to his boss. He could, in fact, say that he was sycophantic loyal, a sycophant, somebody who admired his boss enormously, someone that, you know, almost felt like had the sort of loyalty that almost is attributed sometimes to a dog vis-a-vis its master, someone who could not see anything wrong from Yoweri Museveni. Everything he saw was nothing but gold, nothing but diamond. You know, there is this expression in basketball saying, nothing but net.
I wonder if he shares the same view now after the events that have happened.
You know, I would want to be a fly in the room in which he was sitting when the statement was made, because someone in fact suggested that he was probably one of the first few people to be fired via Twitter, the social media.
Interesting.
So let's face it, I think that when you think about it, the man had done his part. He had been the Inspector General of the Uganda Police. Others might say, no, certainly not the Ugandan Police. In fact, he was the Inspector General of the National Resistance Movement. And later, I was told by others around 2016 that he ceased to be the Inspector General of the National Resistance Movement because in that particular context, he actually became the Inspector General of Yoweri Museveni. It was about protection of the regime and protection of the individual of Yoweri Museveni and family and colleagues. He ceased really, at least in the eyes of most Ugandans, to be a servant of the Ugandans because he wasn't in fact protecting them. You have seen a lot of murders reported in Kampala, the capital, in Entebbe, in places like PG and what have you, all sorts of things, and nothing seems really, there seems to be no answer, no solution.
How about people who said that he was head of a criminal police gang? Police in Uganda was operating as a criminal gang. At his helm, you had, of course, let's not forget to mention the way they treated opposition leaders in Uganda. This guy was brutally taking on opposition leaders in Uganda. I don't know, he was also responsible for committing several other crimes that we don't even know of.
Well, he obviously developed some groups, some militias. You're talking about, you remember the Chiboko squad? The people that wielded, you know, like sticks, and they were actually beating people who belonged to the opposition. He also formed some kind of border, you know. He had the border people who were riding bicycles and what have you, and chasing people who subscribed to a different point of view. He had some other groups that he made and what have you, and people really have since discovered that this man, who was supposedly supposed to be keeping, you know, peace and what have you and stuff like that, he had actually hired the people who started seeing themselves or viewing themselves as actually above the law. These are the people that were basically in the business of corruption, people who were
extorting money,
extortion, ransoms, and all that kind of stuff. And some of these people were very young. They really came from backgrounds where they did not have opportunity to have an accumulation of property and what have you. And they saw this as an opportunity for them to do nothing but to make sure that they liberate themselves from poverty.
Yeah, very briefly, should Museveni be worried about a General Kari Kihura? Can he become the Chiwenga in Zimbabwe?
I don't think so, because I don't honestly think that Kari Kihura has the sort of constituency, has the sort of political or military constituency that Zimbabwean General Constantino Chiwenga had, or that he even has what a man called Emerson Mnangagwa the crocodile ever had. I don't think so. I have talked to a lot of people who even come from his place. They do not frankly talk about him favorably. I don't know that he has that capacity. I think that it was time to be thrown, under the bus, because let's face it, Museveni himself knows that Kihura has a fire on him. If there is anything that Museveni probably has done in the last so many years and what have you, the person that has that information about him, whether it is rigging elections or what have you, happens to be Kihura. But Kihura had also reached a point where the vast majority of the Ugandans really did not like him. And so if Museveni wanted to continue ruling Uganda, he has to sort of reinvent himself. And therefore, what does he do? He has to kind of like distance himself or stay away from Kihura.
Okay, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are looking at, again, tomorrow is going to be the election in Sierra Leone. We're talking about the presidential election, parliamentary and local elections. That's pretty much what we are going to be talking about.
Okay, we still have like a minute. Very briefly, personally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the passing of a great journalist, Teddy Cheye in Uganda, who passed away. Recently, he was buried last week. Briefly, maybe bring us up to speed. You've met the guy. He's your comrade in arms. Talk very briefly about him.
I don't know about being comrade in arms, but, I did admire some aspects of his journalism, which was, initially at least, investigative journalism. He was a crusader. You could say that he championed that aspect of journalism, except that unfortunately, towards the end, he ended up pretty much being a victim of what he was in fact fighting against. And hence, he was actually, you remember, he was convicted and he was sent to Luzira maximum prison for 10 years by one justice, Katusi. And due to good behavior, he spent at least 6 years in Luzira. He came back. He was trying to reinvent himself. And he seemed to have been very much rehabilitated because he had become a born again. And he was hoping, in fact, to reincarnate a sort of Uganda Confidential online until, of course, he died. I was told that he was killed by a border, or someone who was riding a bicycle hit him and did not even stop, ran away. It's very unfortunate. And, of course, I should take this opportunity to say, may his soul rest in eternal peace.
Shaka, the feeling is mutual. On that note, we thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you maybe next week or in 2 weeks' time. On that note, thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. Take care and so long from Washington.